Hi, my name is Nedu. I'm a DIY sewing enthusiast based in Lagos. I made this lovely slip set and here's how I did it. The project was inspired by this set by Almina. The following measurements will be required: the bust arc, the bust depth, the waist depth, the bust circumference, the hip circumference. And for the skirt you'd need the hip depth, the waist circumference, the hip circumference, the skirt length. You'd also need to add the following wearing ease: starting with the top pattern, layer 2 pieces of paper and then fold in half. Then draw a top line representing the highest point of your shoulder. The bust depth is the vertical distance from the high shoulder point to the nipple or bust point. This is the east bust divided by 4. And the waist depth is the vertical distance from the high shoulder point to the natural waistline. So at that point, draw light broken lines which will serve as a waistline guide. The hip depth is the vertical distance from the waistline to the hip line. And this is the east hip divided by 4. Connect the bust line to the hip line with temporary broken lines and then do a bit of waist shaping, going inwards at the waistline by 1 inch, and then connect the bust line to the waistline and then the hip line. So erase the broken lines and extend the line 1 inch above the bust line. This will create the underarm point. So make the line less angular by curving it slightly inwards at the waist and slightly outwards at the hip. So it's a smooth curve this way. So the bust arc is the horizontal distance between both nipples divided by 2. To get the neckline depth, go up 4 inches from the bust line. The neckline width is equivalent to the bust arc plus 1.5 inches. Then connect the neckline point to the underarm point, which will create a guideline for the underarm curve. So to get the final length of the top, extend from the hip line downwards by 1.5 inches. This will make the top long enough to tuck in. At this stage, the current shape of the pattern represents the back of the top. So use a tracing wheel to trace the shape so that it shows on the paper underneath, and then later trace it out. This method saves a lot of time. So go inwards by 1/2 inch at the center of the underarm line and then draw a curve. To avoid gaping in the underarm area, draw a dot 1 inch wide and ensure that the dot legs are equal in length. This is really important. And then transfer the dot from the underarm to the side. First of all, draw a line at the side, connect it to the bust point, cut it open, and then cut out the dot. Spread it until it closes up, which will naturally open up a space at the side. This way, the dot has been transferred from the underarm to the side, and then close up the gap with a piece of paper. It's very simple. And here's the completed front pattern. I'm just going to cut it out now. So because the pattern was drafted on a folded piece of paper, it will open up to a full pattern. And this is a good thing because the slip set is being cut on the bias grain. So because the fabric is cut on the bias grain, there's a tendency for the back piece to expand after cutting. So I'm going to trim about 1/2 inch on both sides to prevent this. And here are the completed pattern pieces for the front and back. Make sure to add sewing allowances all around the patterns. And now the skirt. So fold a wide piece of paper. The quarter waist is the waist circumference divided by 4. The hip depth is the vertical distance from the waistline to the hip line. And the quarter east hip is the east hip divided by 4. It's a midi skirt, and so I used a length of 31 inches. I drew out the bottom edge to the same width as the quarter east hip. Connected the waistline to the hip line with a curve and the hip line to the bottom edge with a straight line. So to create the flared silhouette, I extended the hemline outwards by 4 inches and then connected this new point to a point slightly above the hip line curve. To achieve a correctly curved waistline, I'd come down by 1/2 inch and then reconnect the decline points to the side seam with a slightly curved line. And then erase the original straight line. To maintain a balanced flare all around the skirt, Ensure that the distance from the hip line point to the hem is the same for both the straight line and the diagonal line. So come down by half an inch and then draw a slightly curved new hemline connecting both points. Erase all the temporary guidelines, and here you have your finished skirt pattern. Add sewing allowances all around and then cut out the pattern. Opening the folded piece of paper will reveal a full pattern, which is a good thing because the skirt is being cut on the bias grain. So facing was used to finish the top edges of the 3 pieces. So trace the pattern like this. Come down 3 inches from the top and then mark it out. Trace it out on another piece of paper underneath, and then you have this. I highly recommend using a lightweight drapey fabric for this project. First of all, draw out bias grain lines on all the patterns. They are diagonal lines slanting at a 45-degree angle. Cutting slippery fabrics like silk can be really tricky, but I find that tracing around with a marker before cutting makes it so much easier. So first place the pattern so that the bias grain lines are aligned to the selvage, and then pin the fabric down, trace around with your marker and slice around using a rotary cutter. And after removing the pins, you'd observe that the marker has left a visible outline of the pattern. So fabrics cut on the bias grain have the tendency to stretch if overhandled, so after cutting, just fold carefully and keep aside. Then cut the front piece the same way. Align the bias grain lines to the selvage, pin down, trace with the marker, cut and fold carefully, keep to one side till you're ready to sew. And the same thing for the skirt pieces. At this point, you'll be an Olympic champion of cutting slippery fabrics. So here are the 2 skirt pieces. I find that fabrics cut on the bias grain have the tendency to stretch and become wider than the actual measurement. To prevent this, do a bit of stay stitching, sewing 1/4 inch from the top edge using your widest sewing machine stitch. I do not enjoy sewing dots, so I like to start with that so it's out of the way. So what I do is I first of all hand base the dart, like sewing with temporary hand sewn stitches, and then I sew over with the sewing machine, and then I later unravel the hand sewn stitches. This just helps me maintain precision. And after sewing, press down the darts with a warm iron. I used French seams to sew the top. So first thing to do will be to place the front and back pieces with the wrong sides facing, and then sew with a 1/4 inch sewing allowance. And afterwards, open it up and fold again, sewing with the right sides facing this time, but with 3/8 inch sewing allowance. So as you can see, the fabric edge is sealed in nicely. It's a beautiful finish using a French seam. For the skirt, there'll be a seam along the entire length of one side, and on the other side, there'll be a zipper and then a seam. I also used French seams to sew the skirt. I think it's a beautiful finishing technique for handling lightweight fabrics like silk chamois. And on the other side of the skirt, I used bias tape to bind the seam allowance down till the bottom of the zipper, and then I did a simple fold and stitch to the seam allowance for the rest of the way, like a full French seam. Attach a strip of visible interfacing to the zipper allowance area so that the area is reinforced and strong enough to handle the weight of the zip. Then I also cut out the facing pieces on the bias grain. It's important to cut out the facing on the same grain lines that the shell was cut. And after cutting, I pressed visible interfacing to each of the facing pieces. This will give it enough volume so that it stays flat and stays in. Then place the skirt facing pieces together, right sides facing, and stitch along one side. And after stitching the facing, open up the zipper and attach both along the top edge from one side to the other. And do the same for the front facing pieces, but this time around stitch on both sides. So attach the stitched facing to the top edge of the top, making sure that their side seams are perfectly aligned. I like cutting skinny straps on the bias grain. I think that angle gives it more flexibility. So I cut 2 straps using my ruler as a guide. I got a loop turner recently. I think it's an amazing tool for turning out skinny straps inside out. You could also use a bobby pin if you haven't got one. And after turning both straps out, press both with a warm iron. Sandwich each one between the facing and the shell at the 4 corners in front and at the back. And then stitch all together. So when using facing, it is very important to do a bit of understitching. This ensures that the facing lays flat and stays inside the garment. So while understitching, you're basically sewing the edge of the sewing allowance to the edge of the facing. Then also do the understitching on the skirt. Finalize the skirt facing by stitching into the skirt zipper allowance. It's a short vertical stitch. Afterwards, trim any bulkiness and then flip it inwards. Make sure to press everything after sewing, but use a warm iron because silk is really tricky. I love the top, it looks very dainty and sweet. The skirt hemline was finished with a narrow folded hem, which I really love. You could either do this manually or use a rolled hem presser foot if you know how to handle it. So here's the final look. I absolutely love this set. I think it's a beautiful garment. It's feminine. It's just lovely. And the best bit is that I have 2 separates that can be paired and matched with other things in my wardrobe. Happy sewing!